On the build show today, we're talking heat pump water heaters. I got some serious nerdy stats we're gonna be going through, y'all. I've got 7 water heaters, which I believe makes up every single heat pump water heater on the market today. We're gonna go through each individual one, talk about the stats, the pros and cons, figure out which one is the best water heater for your next build, remodel, or replacement job. Today's build show, no sponsors, all nerdery. Let's get going. Okay, y'all, before we jump into all the nerdiness here, if you haven't seen my other video that I made with Energy Star, giving you the overview on these and the basic stats, highly recommend you watch that video. But before we jump into the first model, let me point out that we've got 3 different types of heat pump water heaters here. These 3 models here represent 220, 240 volt models, basically not a 110 circuit. And so these would be kind of a normal direct replacement for a resistance electric tank. You would be shocked how many resistance electric water heaters there are in America. Something like 40% of America's hot water comes from an electric resistance tank, which is basically a glorified hairdryer. It's just using electricity to heat an element in the tank and make hot water. And if you've seen my other videos, you know that if you look at the energy guide on those models, they are darned expensive to operate. I mean, we're talking like, for an average family, $500 a year. That could be like $40 a month in electricity strictly to make hot water. All of these units behind me make the same amount of hot water, will give you a hot shower, but are gonna use something like 75% less energy. Now, the other 3 models right behind me here, starting with the REAM, the A.O. Smith, and the GE, believe it or not, these are going to include a 120 volt plug, and you can even plug these into, several of these models, a shared circuit, meaning if you had a gas water heater in your garage and you wanted to change it out to a heat pump, you could literally pull that gas unit out, plug this into an available outlet, and go, and you'd be good to go. It'd be a direct one-to-one replacement. Now, we're gonna get into the specifics about sizing up and some of that kind of stuff. Stay tuned for that. And then lastly on this list, we only have 1 model currently available. I understand there are some manufacturers that are going to be offering this. This is what they call a split unit, meaning this outdoor compressor that actually makes the hot water is outside, but the tank that stores that hot water is inside. The cool thing about these is there's no heat pump here, so this could be like, you know, you might have a low boy, let's say, in your current house that's tucked into a small closet or is underneath the stairs. You could pull this out and put this in, and you'd have a direct one-to-one replacement. One thing to note about this, though, is they're connected with a water line. So you're gonna have to get a 1/2 inch or actually 2 1/2 inch PEX lines from this tank to the outside. So I would say typically, this may not be a replacement. This is more like new construction or remodel. This is actually the model I have in my house, although I have a bigger tank size. So with that being said, since there's no manufacturers represented here, I have no allegiances, let's just go straight down the list in alphabetical order. Let's go ahead and pull out the American Standard. Okay, y'all, first up, American Standard. Again, this is a 240 volt. I actually don't know what the difference is between 208, 220, and 240. Ask your electrician about that. Reminds me of the funny scene in the movies where Michael Keaton's father-in-law says, "What are you wiring with here, son? 220? And then Michael Keaton goes, "I don't know, 220, 221, whatever it takes."
Yeah, you're gonna make it all 220?
Yeah, 220, 221, whatever it takes.
That's kind of how I feel about this, but in other words, this is not a 120. This is gonna replace your standard electric resistance tank that's already wired for a probably 30 amp breaker with a 220 line. So that does come in 3 different models though, a 50, a 65, and an 80. And this is gonna have a backup resistance element in it as well that probably is gonna kick on in some type of high water output mode. I'm assuming this has multiple modes. One of the very first features on their feature sheet is iMemory, where it self-learns your output and says, hey, I'm using a lot of water from 7 a.m. to 8 a.m., and it supposedly might change its mode. I don't quite know how that works, but that's a very intriguing feature. Of course, it's got integrated Wi-Fi and some additional app that goes with it. I'll be honest, I'm not a huge fan of connected water heaters to an app. I don't personally think that's a feature I would use unless it's maybe a second home, but I can see that if you own multiple properties. Another thing that's interesting about this unit though is they do call out its UEF, and it says up to 4.01 UEF. And if you look at the energy guide, this one actually has the lowest number on an annual basis from any energy guide from all the units that were sent to me for this video. 104 annual energy use. That's crazy, especially if you compare that, like I showed earlier, to that standard electric resistance model, which might have almost $500 in annual cost. This is, holy cow, quite a bit less at 104. That's a really big deal. So if you have a standard resistance electric heater, going to this could save you like $400 a year in electricity costs. That's a lot of money, and it's not going to take you long to pay this unit back, even if you had to pay a little bit more after rebates and that federal tax credit that's available for you underneath the Inflation Reduction Act. Check out my other video to learn more about that. A couple other things that I like about this model in particular, it says it operates in temperatures as low as 36 degrees Fahrenheit. So if you're like me in Texas, where there's a lot of water heaters in garages, this would be a good model because it's always going to be above 36 in your garage. And the other thing I like about this unit in particular, it calls out that it's got dual cathodic protection, meaning that these tanks are going to rust over time if it doesn't have an anode rod. And this one includes a powered anode rod. I'm not sure of any other tank in this group that has a powered rod, and it's got a standard magnesium rod. So in theory, this one's going to provide a long time of rust protection on the tank. Two other things I want to point out from the spec sheet. This one points out its sound level is 49 decibels. That's pretty low, but we're going to find some a little bit lower here in a minute. And the other thing that you really want to look at when you're comparing specs for any unit that you might consider for your house is that first hour rating. Now remember, these ratings are a general rating because everywhere in the US is different. We have different household sizes. We have different amounts of hot air in the house or in the garage or wherever. And most importantly, we're also going to have different inlet temperatures. For instance, where I am in Austin, Texas, we often have inlet temperatures in the 60-degree mark, which means that a tank like this doesn't have to work very hard to get up to 120. Whereas if we're in Minnesota, we might have an inlet temp in the, let's say, 30s or 40s, which means it's going to have to work pretty hard to get it up to that higher rise. So anytime we're looking at the specs, remember, these are generic specs for all of the US. You have to think about specifically where you are and what that performance might be. But I think the reason why they're making these in such varying sizes, 50, 65, and 80, is because you might decide, hey, I'm only a family of two. I've never run out of hot water before with my, let's say, 40-gallon gas model. So it's no big deal for me to maybe use a 50 or a 65. I don't necessarily need to go to the 80. Anecdotally, I've heard from plumbers out there that whenever they're replacing a gas hot water heater with a heat pump water heater, they're always going to the biggest size available. And to be honest, I kind of did that a little bit with my house. I put an 80 in my house because I was worried about would I run out of hot water. I haven't run out of hot water. I'll tell you some more stories later when I get to my model that I put in. But I think it's interesting that people are upselling so that they don't get callbacks. I think that you should really decide for yourself what you think is right. And almost all these models have the ability for you to turn up the heat level in the tank, and almost all of them have some type of thermostatic mixing valve. So I don't think that's going to be an issue. Okay, let's summarize this American Standard. It looks to me like this is a good unit. It's got all the options available. It's got all the stuff that I like to see in a model. This would be a really easy replacement if you have a standard electric tank. Remember though that you've got a filter up top here, so you need to give plenty of room to get that filter out. You got to look at all your clearances, and you got to make sure that you're putting this into a space that's going to have plenty of hot air into it. But remember, this can't work in below 37-degree temperatures. So if you've got a garage mounted unit and you're in Maine, this may not be the best choice for you. This would be perfect in a basement in Maine, but not in a garage, not in a space that's going to get regularly below 37 degrees. With that being said, the last thing I want to check on all these units is where are they made? Where are they assembled? I'm curious to see whether we've got any American brands here or if these are all made in China. Not always easy to find, but on this one I found it on the logo that has all the specs. It says assembled in Mexico. Pretty interesting, North American made. I've kind of heard anecdotally that since the pandemic, because shipping costs were so high and because there's been a little bit of a blowback on made in China kind of in general, it's interesting to see that these units, especially because they're so big, they'd be heavy and they'd be more expensive. They'd take more of a shipping container. I think we're going to find more of these are made in North America. So now let's go to the next manufacturer in the alphabet. Next up, A.O. Smith Voltex. This happens to be their 80-gallon model, but they also make this in a 66-gallon, which I'm assuming is probably just a little bit smaller, but probably utilizes the same compressor on the top. Now, unlike the last model though, this one comes with a standard plug. Check that out. You're literally gonna plug that right into the wall, and it's gonna work on a standard 110 circuit. That is pretty wild. They really are marketing this particular model as a, hey, I've got a gas water heater, and in an emergency, I need to replace it. So boom, we can go right off the shelf and grab one of these. But in general, when you're thinking about switching from a gas to an electric heat pump, you're gonna wanna think about upsizing your tank. So this 80 right here is meant to be a replacement, let's say for a 50-gallon gas. It's gonna have about the same first hour rating. And let's look that up since I've got the spec sheet here. The first hour rating on this 80 is 93 gallons. That is a lot of hot water. Now this model, along with the other two that are 110 plug-in models, have some new stuff going on that some of the other models, or what I've seen in the past, didn't have. These have an integrated mixing valve inside the unit, which allows it to run at a hotter temperature in the tank. In fact, this one goes up to 145 degrees, if I read that correctly on the spec sheet. But the water actually coming out into your hot water system is tempered. That allows you to store more heat, basically, so you'd have a greater amount of output with less of a tank size. So this is a really cool little model. A couple of things that really caught my attention on the spec sheet. Top water connections, I really like that. It's gonna make it really easy to replace out. And this one requires less space around it than some of the other units. The manufacturer says 450 cubic feet of airspace around the hot water heater. Also pretty low noise, 45 decibels compared to the last model that we saw that was 49. And this one has a leak sensor with a water shutoff valve included. Funny little story about A.O. Smith. As several manufacturers were sending me these units and asking, hey, do you want to get on with a tech person? I said, yeah, I would love to talk to a tech at your company to make sure I understand all the cool specs and features, especially these 120 models, which are brand new to the market. So my team set me up with a Zoom call, and I get on the call, and the person on the call is A. Smith. And I didn't know his name, but I made this funny joke. Oh, isn't that funny? You're with A.O. Smith. You probably have the same initials. I wonder if your middle name's Oliver or something like that, so you'd have the same initials. And deadpan, he goes, yeah, A.O. Smith was my great-grandfather. And I was like, I feel like an idiot. I'm sorry, I didn't realize. I think he's heard that joke a few too many times. He didn't particularly think it was hilarious, but I thought it was crazy that the product manager for this unit, the engineer, was literally A.O. Smith's great-grandson who had the same exact name. And he was like this, you know, A.O. Smith the 7th or whatever, I can't remember, but super cool to be able to talk to him and get these specs. The two things that really stood out to me was the internal leak sensor and also a shutoff that goes along with that. So, hey, I've got a leak, and oh, by the way, we're also gonna automatically shut off the water to it. And again, the fact that this is ready to go right on a 110 circuit, very, very cool. Now, one thing I wanna mention on these models that are 110, they're not gonna include a resistance heat module inside there. That's how they're able to operate. Their only heat pump only mode is what's happening here. But I think with the specs on this unit and with it being able to go to a hotter temperature, I'm really impressed. I think this is a really big deal. And certainly this would work as a gas replacement, but no reason why you couldn't use this on new construction or a remodel as well. Okay, before we move on, let's check where it's made. And let's see, it's gonna be on, okay, this label here is gonna show where it's made. So here it is, made in Mexico. So just like the last model, made in America, just a little south of the border. Next up in alphabetical order, Bradford White. They call this their Aerotherm series. This happens to be the 65-gallon model. I'm gonna affectionately call this as the R2D2 model, but they also make this in a 50 and an 80 model. Now, interesting, when you look at their spec sheet, the 50 model does not look like R2D2, but the 65 and the 80 does. So check this out. The top mounted unit is the same in all three models. The tank size varies. And what's fascinating here is I heard from a friend of mine that if you have a problem, it's made to pop this heat pump off and drop a new one on worst case scenario, so that you could keep the tank, but if you needed service, this whole thing could pop off and a new one could actually come on. That's pretty interesting. I hadn't heard that, I didn't see that in the spec sheet, but a friend of mine that's a trusted source told me that, so I do believe him. Now, a couple of interesting things about this model in particular, they only sell this through a dealer network, through installers. You can't find this at the home center. That's kind of interesting. I actually kind of like that. Not sold in retail. A couple of things that I found fascinating here. This is a 220, 240 volt model, so it's also going to have resistance heat in there. So if you were outside of that 35 degrees, meaning it's 25 degrees in your garage, it's still going to work, no problem. You're just not going to get the benefit of the heat pump working. Same is supposedly true above 120, although I don't know why it wouldn't work above that. It seems like hotter the better. Also really like that the filter on this is super easy to access. This is just a washable filter. And by the way, kind of anecdotally, I would say if some of the heat pump water heaters that I've had in crawl spaces or garages, the filter doesn't need to be cleaned very often. I found it pretty clean when I've looked at it every 6 months. On the other hand, I've got a unit that's outside of a laundry room. That one does. There's enough lint that gets kicked up by that dryer. That filter needs to be cleaned much more often. So any manufacturer's recommendation on clean this filter every certain amount of months, that goes out the window if you put these in a more dirty environment or a more clean environment. One thing that I found fascinating about this unit too, I'm kind of skipping forward, I've left this at the end on the others. This is the only unit in the bunch here that's actually made in America. This is actually a made in Michigan product. Very cool to see. Every other manufacturer is going to be somewhere else besides the States. This one's actually made in America. And the last thing I want to point out on this model, I really like how Bradford White put this $1 sticker on the top that's the quick start guide. I mean, why haven't other manufacturers, if you're watching this from other manufacturers, do this on yours too. This is fantastic for a homeowner. A nice, big, bold, I don't need to get my glasses out to read the fine print. It's all right there. That's fantastic. Oh, and another thing I forgot to mention too, Bradford White has this Connect kit, which allows you to connect to this to Wi-Fi, but this is a detached model rather than a built-in model, because if this water heater was in your garage or basement and you didn't have a good Wi-Fi signal, this could be mounted up to, it sounds like 100 feet from this unit, would talk back to the unit and grab your Wi-Fi signal. Again, I said it earlier, I'm not a huge fan of Wi-Fi connection on water heaters. I don't want to update my Bradford White app if I've got a new iOS on my iPhone, but I get it. If it's a vacation home or you own multiple properties, that might be why you do it. That being said, love the Made in America. Let's keep moving. Okay, next up is the GE Geospring. This is their 4th generation model. GE was out of the market for some period of time and they're back with this model, but they were one of the very first models to the marketplace in 2008 with a heat pump water heater. I suspect that their embedded long-term knowledge is going to go a long ways with this brand new model. But this is not actually a working model. All the other models we've been looking at, I could plug in and hook up water today. This is a trade show kind of demo model. So I don't know all the specifics on this, but what I understand is that they're going to offer this in a 240 and a 120 option. So you can get this on either side. They're probably going to have different tank sizes. I don't know that yet. As of published date, this is not on the market, but my understanding is in 2024, this is going to be available. I'm hearing that this model has leak detection with an automatic shutoff. That's a pretty cool feature. It also has a sensing anode rod to let your homeowner know, hey, that anode rod's getting depleted. We got to actually change that out. So that's a big deal. Beyond that, the other thing I liked about this unit without even being able to plug it in was I really like this easy controller. They've got a kind of a turtle and a hare on here that says reheat speed and a couple leaves on the right. And I suspect that you'll be able to hit this mode select and change it from, let's say, heat pump only mode, which is going to be your slowest and your most energy savings, to some type of hybrid mode in the middle, and maybe the rabbit mode, which is probably all electric mode, but is going to save you the least amount of money. And then you can also set it to vacation mode. That's a really nice, very intuitive mode selector. So big props to GE for that. I suspect that's going to be good. And this probably is going to tell you, hey, the anode needs to be replaced. Probably something will light up there. Or, hey, it's time to change the, not change, but clean. That's got 2 filters on the side and 1 on the top. Clean the filter. So this is going to be a cool model. I don't know the rest of the details, so you're going to have to stay tuned for what's its uniform energy factor, what's the annual energy cost, that sort of thing, coming in 2024. The other thing I'm not 100% certain of, but I'm hearing, is that this is going to actually be made in South Carolina, so this might also be a made in America model. Again, I'm not 100%. At this moment, the only one that I know for sure is that Bradford White. But that being said, let's keep going on the list. Okay, next up, LG, and you can see right away, this is a sexy beast. Big props to the South Koreans. This is pretty nice looking. If you've got a water heater that's in your living room or in your master bedroom exposed, definitely this is the winner on the looks category. Now, LG has a couple things on their spec sheet that, I'll be honest, I don't totally understand. I wasn't able to get on with an engineer. But they're saying on their spec sheet that this is the first dual inverter technology on a heat pump water heater in the US, which their dual inverter compressor allows the maximization, that is a really hard word to say, of the power of the heat pump and can provide up to 20% more hot water in turbo mode. What that means, I'm not totally sure, but if you look at the output on this model, it's pretty high. So for instance, this happens to be their 58-gallon model. Remember, this is a 240 volt. And the first hour rating on kind of standard mode is 65 gallons, but turbo mode allows this relatively standard size water heater to get up to 80 gallons in turbo mode. Now, they also make this in an 80-gallon model, which I'm assuming looks the same, it's just bigger. And again, I'm not quite sure what that means, but I'm impressed with the amount of hot water output. That's pretty high up there. But what really caught my attention on this nerdy spec sheet was this sound pressure level. So on auto mode, on kind of standard mode, 40 decibels. And if you bump it into turbo mode, it adds a whopping 2 decibels to 42 decibels. So not only is this probably the best looking, I think this likely is the quietest in the group. I wasn't able to see the actual most of the other ones had the energy guide label slapped on there, so I don't quite know where this lands, but the uniform energy factor on this is 3.75, and I believe the bigger model is closer to 4.0, so this is among the most efficient models according to the Energy Star labels. Pretty impressive. In terms of where it's made, this is the only model that I saw that was actually made in China. Interesting, huh? Next up, REAM ProTerra. My very first heat pump water heater I installed, 2009-ish, was a REAM, still going to this day, so I have good feelings for REAM. I also like that they've been in the business for a long time continuously. So I don't know what model number they're on now or what generation number, but I suspect we're on the maybe 6th or 7th generation. They've been iterating and doing better. Now, REAM makes 120 and 240 volt models. This happens to be 120, and they were the first in the market with a 120. So like some of those other ones, you notice this one has a regular 120 plug. This is meant to be plugged into any old circuit that you've got. That's really, really cool. Now, this model in particular, though, does not have a resistance backup element, heat pump only. What does that mean for you? Well, it means it's going to have really good savings because we're not going to be making heat in hairdryer mode, right? It's only going to be using the heat pump to make heat. But you need to be cautious where you put this. I actually did not see it in their specs, but I suspect that this, oh, I did see it here. This one won't work below 37 degrees. And as a result, REAM actually has a page dedicated on their spec sheet to show where we would typically install one of these units. And they're generally selling these in the South, anywhere from kind of the left coast all the way down through pretty much all of Texas, all of Florida, and the Gulf Coast states. This is intended for those kind of warmer climates. Your garage in Texas, at least for me, is never going to go below 37, except maybe once every 5 years. So this shouldn't be a problem. The other thing that we get in these lower states, higher inlet temperatures. So heat pump only makes a lot of sense. They sent me talking points on this from REAM, and I didn't see this in their specs, but one of their talking points is that the compressor on this is actually a 1-ton compressor, so 12,000 BTUs. It's interesting, manufacturers aren't really forthcoming with what their BTU ratings are or what their compressor size is. I have the sense that most of these are around 8,000 BTUs, so this compressor a little bit bigger. That's probably how they're eliminating the resistance heating on there and going with heat pump only mode on this. A couple things that I liked about this one too. This one has an integration for demand response ready. It's got a CT245 port, which basically looks like an HDMI connection right on this side right here. So you could plug this into your utility so they could say, hey, we're gonna experience a brownout today at 5 o'clock if we don't reduce our energy costs. And they could connect to this unit potentially and shut it down or say, hey, don't fire up until nighttime. I suspect a lot of these 120 models also are probably gonna have some type of control that says, hey, my power is really cheap from midnight to 5 a.m., so I want you to make me really hot water during that time, and don't make a lot of hot water when power is really expensive. I suspect some of these models have that already, and I'm just not aware of that on the spec sheet. Now, REAM also, I like that they make them in various size ranges. They go down to 40, and most manufacturers kind of start, it seems like, at 50. They go down to 40, and then they've got 40, 50, 65, and 80. And again, they make them in 120s like this, or they make them in 240-volt models. So great job, as always, from REAM. The one downside, though, I would say of this unit, this one kind of looks the most, what am I trying to say, standard? I don't know. It's not dorky so much as it's just like, this is what they've always looked like. So I'd like to see REAM do a little better on the looks department in the future, but in terms of performance and longevity and reliability, I think this is a great unit. I think I forgot to mention this. It looks like it's got a leak guard control. I may have missed that on the specs. Sure does. It's got a leak guard water shutoff valve already on here. So there must be some type of a sensor that says, hey, I'm sensing a leak in the pan, and let's shut off the water to this unit. That's pretty cool. All right, that being said, let's figure out where this one is made. Let's see if I can find it on the specs in here. Okay, here we go. Assembled in Mexico. We got another North American model, but made in Mexico. Okay, y'all, last but not least, the only unit that's a split model. This is Senko. I think I've been mispronouncing it as SanCO2. But this is a split model, meaning the outdoor unit that actually makes the hot water is outside. This looks like a standard, 1 or 1.5 ton heat pump that was going to heat and cool your house, but its sole purpose is to make hot water. And then it's going to be connected to an indoor unit. The connection is just 2 PEX pipes. I actually have this model at my house, and I've got a PEX line going to it and then a PEX line returning. You got to insulate those really well, and you also got to put a heat tape on them like I did at my house. But the indoor unit is simply just storage. There's nothing being made here. There's no electricity in this. It's just a storage tank. And they make this in 3 different sizes, and if I understand this correctly, the outdoor unit is always the same size. The only thing that's going to change is the indoor tank size. So check this out. Pretty interesting. This is the 43 gallon, which would be a really easy direct replacement if you had like a lowboy electric tank at your house. They also make an 83 gallon. That's what I have at my house. And they make a really big 119 gallon. Now this one, though, has some features that are totally different from the rest of the group in my estimation. First off, the outdoor temperature this works in is minus 25 Fahrenheit to over 100 degrees. That's crazy, meaning even in Austin, Texas last winter when it was 17 degrees out, I had no problem. This unit was making my hot water, no problem. It would literally work to minus 25. Now, I suspect that you get below 0, it's not going to be as efficient as it is when it's 95 degrees out, but you're still going to have plenty of hot water. And honestly, when I got my unit, I was a little worried about how much hot water I needed. I'd had a gas tankless in my old house, and I was switching over to this heat pump. So I went with the 83 gallon model. And one of the reasons why I like this unit is that this was the one that would go the hottest. This one actually will make water up to 150 degrees. Now I have mine set at a lower temperature. I think when I installed it, I checked it, and it's giving me water out of the tank at 125. It also gives you a thermostatic mixing valve to make sure that you don't scald your occupants. But I figured, I could turn it up if I ran out of hot water. But I've got 3 teenagers in the house and an 11-year-old that seems to not have any care in the world when he's in the shower, and I've yet to run out of hot water. So I've been really impressed with the output on this unit. And if you read the specs on this unit, one of the things that I think is interesting about this is the refrigerant is actually CO2. That's right, carbon dioxide. So if we had a refrigerant leak, we're not worried about ruining the atmosphere from this. It's carbon dioxide as the refrigerant. But they say that that allows them to make hotter water so that you can store more energy in the tank. I don't understand the engineering on that, but I'll let you comment on that in the comments. This one also uses an inverter compressor, and it's got a DC fan motor and water pump, which I'm assuming just means that that's some of the other ways that they make it very, very efficient. One thing I wanted to mention about this particular unit is there's no backup element. It literally is only using the heat pump and sending that to a storage tank. Now, a couple things that are really interesting about this one. This is the only unit that's made in Japan. The compressor, the outdoor unit on the box says made in Japan, and then the box for the tank says made in Australia. That's kind of interesting. The other thing about this tank though, which is totally different from the other models here, this is a stainless steel tank. So corrosion, not an issue. You're not gonna have a leak on this tank from corrosion when it's stainless steel. And as a result, from all these different things we talked about, this is also probably the most expensive model in the group. Now that tax credit that I mentioned earlier in the video with the Inflation Reduction Act is going to be pretty nice though. It's going to give you up to a $2,000 tax credit for the price of the unit plus the install, 30% of that is. So this unit being pretty expensive, you might want to take advantage of whatever local rebates are available to you and that tax credit, but all these units are going to be available for both rebates and tax credits. I did another video earlier this year with the EPA talking about that, but I'll put a link in the description so you can find those rebates. And in general, if you're going to heat pump, a couple things I want to mention. There are some crusty old people out there that don't love this tech for whatever reason or just are not used to installing it. Don't get talked out of one of these units because it's going to lower the temperature of your house by 15 degrees or some other weird kind of myth that's being put out there by somebody. Go to the EPA website. I'll put a link for a finder for a plumber and for a retail finder so you can find someone who is used to and familiar with installing these. I really think this is the way of the future. I've got this unit at my house. I absolutely love it. Don't be freaked out by the price. As I said earlier, there's some amazing rebates and tax credits available. No matter which manufacturer you choose, it's really interesting to see that these manufacturers have taken great strides to make sure that you don't run out of hot water. Some of these units today can go up to very hot temperatures in the tank. Most of them include a thermostatic mixing valve. I got to tell you, I've never run out of hot water at my house, even though I've got an 80-gallon heat pump water heater. And I think if you've got a smaller family, you should consider a smaller unit. The energy savings is definitely there, and the reliability is there as well. These have been on the market for just shy of 20 years now, so this is not new technology. This is very old tech that seems to be working really well. Guys, if you're not currently a subscriber, hit that subscribe button below. We've got new content here every Tuesday and every Friday. Follow us on TikTok or Instagram. Otherwise, we'll see you next time on The Build Show.